My mom left my family for her affair partner who ruined my childhood, married him, and now they want me to move back home after they publicly shamed me at my dad's funeral. The day of my dad's funeral was already unbearable. I'd spent the week preparing myself for the emotional weight of saying goodbye, sorting through photos for the memorial, and rehearsing the words I wanted to say about the man who had shaped my life. But nothing could have prepared me for the spectacle my mom, Clara, 50, and her husband, Jerry, 60M, turned it into. I spotted them the moment they entered the church, walking in arm like they were arriving at a gala instead of a funeral. Jerry's smug grin and Clara's self-assured demeanor turned heads immediately. The whispers started right away. My family's story wasn't a secret. Everyone knew how Clara had left my dad over a decade ago for Jerry and his business partner. Everyone knew how my dad had worked tirelessly to rebuild his life after she left, while Jerry took credit for his success and walked away with both his wife and part of his business. They hadn't just ruined my family, they'd ruined my dad's reputation in town. Seeing them here, pretending to mourn the man they had both betrayed, made my stomach churn. I sat rigid in the front row, my hands clenched in my lap as the service began. I'd prepared a eulogy, a tribute to the man who had raised me, who had been my rock when everything else fell apart. But as I walked to the lectern, I felt their eyes on me, Clara's scrutinizing, Jerry's full of that infuriating self-satisfaction. I kept my focus on the crowd, speaking from my heart about my dad's kindness, his resilience, and the sacrifices he had made for me. My voice cracked as I mentioned how he'd never let me feel the weight of Clara's absence, even when I knew it had broken him. I ended with a promise to carry his strength with me, no matter what. When I sat down, I thought that would be it. But then Clara stood, clutching the arm of the pew for balance as she made her way to the front. My stomach twisted. She started with the usual platitudes, how my dad had been a good man and a wonderful father. But then her tone shifted, becoming something I recognized all too well, performative. "I know David would want us to come together as a family in this moment," she said, her voice thick with feigned emotion. "No matter what's happened in the past, forgiveness is what truly honors his memory." The words hit me like a slap. I gritted my teeth, my anger simmering as Clara went on about how love and unity were the things my dad had valued most. She spoke as if she hadn't ripped our family apart, as if Jerry wasn't sitting smugly in the front row like some twisted monument to her betrayal. When the service ended, I did my best to slip out unnoticed, but Clara was waiting for me near the exit, Jerry at her side. "Allison," she said softly, reaching out to touch my arm. I stepped back, avoiding her touch. "What do you want, Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "I just wanted to say how proud your father would have been of you," she said, her tone dripping with faux sincerity. "You spoke so beautifully today." "Thanks," I said flatly, trying to move past her, but she stepped in front of me, her expression shifting into something more insistent. "Allison, I know things have been strained between us, but I think it's time we start healing. Jerry and I have been talking, and we'd really like for you to come home. We've missed you." I stared at her, stunned by the audacity of the suggestion. "Home?" I repeated. "You mean the house you left us in after you ran off with Jerry?" "Allison, that's not fair," Clara said, her tone now laced with frustration. "It's been years. We've all made mistakes, but holding on to this bitterness doesn't help anyone. Your father would want us to move forward, to come together as a family." My chest tightened, anger and disbelief boiling over. "Don't you dare bring Dad into this," I snapped. "He spent his entire life trying to fix the mess you left behind, and now you think you can just waltz back into mine because it's convenient for you?" Jerry stepped in then, his voice infuriatingly calm. "Now hold on. We're just trying to make things right here. It's not healthy to keep holding on to grudges, Allison. Sometimes you have to grow up and let things go." I felt my hands clench into fists. "Grudges? You think this is about grudges? You ruined my family, my dad's career, and his reputation, and now you want to play the victim? You've got to be kidding me." Clara's face hardened, the mask of concern slipping. "Allison, I'm trying to do the right thing here. If you're not ready to accept that, maybe you're the one who needs to take a hard look at yourself." I couldn't take another second of their gaslighting. Without another word, I pushed past them and out the door, the weight of their audacity pressing down on me like a stone. By the time I got home, the anger had turned into something heavier grief mixed with exhaustion. I sat on my couch, staring at a photo of my dad on the table beside me. He'd always told me to choose grace over resentment, but how could I? How could I move forward when the people who had caused so much pain refused to even acknowledge it? I didn't know what my next step would be, but one thing was certain. Clara and Jerry weren't going to steamroll me into their warped version of family. Not again. The days following the funeral were a blur of emotions I couldn't fully process. Grief sat like a weight on my chest. But it wasn't just for my dad, it was for everything he had endured, for the way his life had been torn apart by the very people who had the nerve to sit in that church and talk about forgiveness. Clara and Jerry didn't leave me alone for long. Just 3 days after the funeral, I received a text from her. "Allison, we need to talk. Let's have dinner soon. Love, Mom." I stared at the message, the casual tone of it making my blood boil. After everything, she had the audacity to act as if we were just a normal mother and daughter who could sit down over a meal and hash things out. I didn't respond. The next day, she called. I let it go to voicemail. Then, Jerry called. That was a new low. By the time Clara showed up at my apartment, unannounced, I was already at my breaking point. I opened the door to find her standing there with a carefully neutral expression, holding a grocery bag as if it were some sort of peace offering. "I brought lasagna," she said, holding it out with a forced smile. I crossed my arms, not moving to let her in. "What are you doing here?" "Allison, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm. "You can't keep shutting me out. I know you're upset, but avoiding me isn't going to fix anything." "Fix what exactly?" I asked, my voice sharp, because I don't recall being the one who broke things. Her smile faltered, and she sighed heavily. "Look, I know the funeral was tense, but I'm trying to reach out to rebuild our relationship. Isn't that what your father would have wanted?" There it was again, her favorite weapon-invoking dad's memory to guilt me into submission. I stepped back and let her in, not because I wanted to talk, but because I was too tired to argue on the doorstep where my neighbors could hear. She set the lasagna on the counter and turned to face me, her hands clasped like she was bracing for a difficult conversation. "Allison, I know you have every right to be angry. I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You call leaving your family for Dad's business partner a mistake? You call ruining his career and then showing up at his funeral with Jerry on your arm a mistake?" Clara flinched, but she didn't back down. "Yes, mistakes," she said firmly. "Because that's what they were. I'm not proud of the choices I made back then, but I've tried to move forward, and I'd like for you to move forward with me." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh even to my own ears. "Move forward? With Jerry? The man who humiliated Dad and turned half the town against him? You think I want anything to do with either of you after what you've done?" "Jerry isn't the bad guy you think he is," she said, her voice tightening. "He's been good to me, Allison. He's made me happy, and I think if you just give him a chance." "I don't care about Jerry," I snapped. "I care about the fact that you chose him over us, over me. And now you're here, acting like you deserve some kind of redemption arc just because you feel guilty." Clara's composure cracked, and for a moment I saw real anger flash in her eyes. "You don't know what it was like, Allison," she said, her voice rising. "Your father wasn't perfect. Stop," I said, cutting her off. "You don't get to rewrite history just because it makes you feel better. Dad wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve what you did to him, and neither do I." Her shoulders sagged, and she looked at me with something like pity. "You're so much like him," she said quietly. "So stubborn, so unwilling to let anyone in." "Maybe I learned that from you," I said coldly. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Finally, Clara picked up her bag, her face carefully neutral again. "I hope you'll reconsider," she said as she headed for the door. "Jerry and we want to be there for you, if you'll let us." When the door clicked shut behind her, I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling. Every word of that conversation had felt like reopening an old wound, one I wasn't sure would ever fully heal. Later that night, I stared at the untouched lasagna she'd left on the counter and wondered if I should just throw it away. Instead, I shoved it in the fridge, unable to deal with the symbolism of tossing it in the trash. It wasn't just about the lasagna. It was about Clara, about everything she represented: betrayal, pain, and now this desperate attempt to absolve herself by pulling me back into her orbit. But I wasn't ready to forgive her. I didn't know if I ever would be. The lasagna sat in my fridge like an unwanted guest, a reminder of the conversation I couldn't stop replaying in my head. Clara's audacity to waltz into my life with her carefully packaged remorse and expect me to forget everything was both infuriating and exhausting. I didn't know whether I was angrier at her or at myself for letting her words get under my skin. 3 days later, the silence broke again. This time, it was a voicemail from Jerry. "Hey, Allison. I know things have been a little strained between us, but I wanted to reach out personally. Clara and I were talking, and we think it'd be really good for everyone if we could all sit down together, clear the air. You're a grown woman now, and we all need to act like it. Anyway, call me back when you're ready. We're here for you." I deleted the voicemail without a second thought. The nerve of him acting like this was some minor family squabble to be patched up over a cup of coffee was laughable. He had stolen my mother, my dad's business, and his dignity. And now he thought I'd sit down and play happy family? Still, their persistence wore on me. Clara called again the next morning, leaving another overly saccharine voicemail about wanting to start fresh and how Dad would have wanted us to move forward. By the time she sent a text that evening, I was seething. "Allison, we really want to help you. You've been through so much, and we know it hasn't been easy. Let us support you. You don't have to do everything alone." Support me? They were the reason I was alone in the first place. I ignored the message, hoping they'd finally get the hint. But 2 days later, I came home from work to find Jerry's car parked outside my building. My stomach twisted as I spotted him leaning against the hood, a smug smile on his face like he owned the place. "Allison," he called out as I approached, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a few passing neighbors. "Thought I'd catch you in person, since you haven't been returning our calls." I stopped a few feet away, crossing my arms. "What are you doing here?" Jerry spread his hands, the picture of exaggerated innocence. "Just trying to talk. Clara and I are worried about you. You've been shutting us out, and that's not healthy." I bit back the urge to laugh. "Worried about me? You haven't cared about me for over a decade, Jerry. Don't act like this is about my well-being." He frowned, his tone turning patronizing. "Look, I know things have been complicated, but we're family, Allison, and family works through things. We all make mistakes." "Stop," I said, cutting him off. "Just stop. You don't get to show up here and pretend you're some kind of concerned stepfather. You're not my family. You're the reason my family fell apart." His expression hardened, the mask of kindness slipping. "You need to let go of this bitterness," he said, his voice cold. "It's not doing you any favors." I stepped closer, my anger boiling over. "You don't get to tell me how to feel, Jerry. You and Clara made your choices, and I've lived with the consequences. So don't come here and lecture me about forgiveness or family. You don't know the first thing about either." Jerry's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might lash out. But then he sighed, shaking his head like I was some petulant child throwing a tantrum. "I tried," he said, turning back toward his car. "When you're ready to grow up, you know where to find us." I stood there, watching him drive away, my fists clenched at my sides. The anger coursing through me was almost unbearable, but beneath it, there was something else, something heavier. They weren't going to stop. Clara and Jerry had decided that I was their path to redemption, their way of erasing the damage they'd caused. And no matter how much I pushed back, they were going to keep coming. The thought filled me with dread, but it also steeled my resolve. If they wanted to fight, I wasn't going to back down. They'd taken enough from me already, and I wasn't about to let them take anything more. The confrontation with Jerry outside my apartment left me rattled, but it also solidified one thing. I couldn't keep letting Clara and Jerry dictate the terms of this twisted reconciliation they were trying to force. Their persistence wasn't about making amends. It was about easing their own guilt and rewriting history to make themselves look better. I spent the next few days trying to figure out how to draw a hard line without opening myself up to more of their manipulative tactics. Blocking their numbers crossed my mind, but I knew that would only make them escalate. Clara would probably show up unannounced again, this time with even more dramatic appeals to family. Still, I needed space. When a text from Clara popped up late one evening, I ignored it. But the next morning, when my phone buzzed again, I couldn't help but glance at the screen. Allison, we need to talk. There's something important we need to share with you. Please don't shut us out. It was vague enough to pique my curiosity, but also infuriatingly cryptic. I left the message unread, but the words lingered in my mind all day. What could be so important that Clara thought it might change things? When another text came through that evening, this time with a guilt-laden, "We're just trying to do what's best for you," I finally caved and texted back, "Fine. Meet me at the diner tomorrow at 2. Don't bring Jerry." The next afternoon, Clara was already seated at a booth when I arrived. She had that carefully composed look on her face, the one she always wore when she was trying to act like the reasonable one in an argument. "Allison," she said warmly as I slid into the seat across from her, "thank you for agreeing to meet. I know this hasn't been easy." I crossed my arms, skipping the pleasantries. "What do you want, Mom?" Her smile faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "There's something Jerry and I think you need to know. Something about your father." My stomach dropped, and I felt my hands clench into fists under the table. "What are you talking about?" Clara hesitated, glancing around as if she were worried someone might overhear. Then she leaned in, lowering her voice. "Your father wasn't the man you thought he was, Allison. He had flaws." "Everyone has flaws," I said sharply. "What are you trying to say?" She took a deep breath, her expression carefully measured. "Before I left, your father made some decisions that put us in a very difficult position. Financially, I mean. He made some risky investments, and when they didn't pay off, it left the business and our family in a precarious situation." I stared at her, stunned. "You're blaming Dad for what happened." "I'm not blaming him," Clara said quickly. "I'm just saying there were things you didn't know, things that made it impossible for me to stay." The anger that had been simmering inside me boiled over. "Impossible for you to stay? You left because you were having an affair, Mom. Don't try to twist this into some noble act of self-preservation." Clara flinched, but she didn't back down. "It wasn't just the affair, Allison. Your father was struggling. Mentally, emotionally, he wasn't the man he used to be. And I needed stability. Jerry gave me that." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Stability? You mean Jerry gave you an escape hatch, and now you're trying to justify it by rewriting history?" Clara's face hardened, the veneer of concern slipping. "I'm trying to help you see the bigger picture. Your father wasn't perfect, and neither am I, but that doesn't mean we can't move forward as a family." "Stop saying that," I snapped. "We're not a family. You made sure of that when you chose Jerry over us." Her expression softened, and for a moment I thought I saw real regret in her eyes. But then she said, "I know you're hurting, Allison, but this anger isn't going to bring your father back. It's only going to hurt you in the long run." I stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't get to tell me how to feel, Mom. You lost that right a long time ago." Clara looked up at me, her eyes wide with what seemed like genuine sadness. "I just want to make things right," she said quietly. "Then leave me alone," I said, my voice shaking. "That's the best thing you can do." I walked out of the diner without looking back, the weight of the confrontation pressing heavily on my chest. Clara's attempt to vilify my dad wasn't just manipulative, it was cruel. It felt like a final betrayal, a way for her to absolve herself of guilt by tarnishing the memory of the man who had raised me. But no matter how much she twisted the story, I knew the truth, and I wasn't going to let her take that away from me. Leaving the diner, I felt a storm of emotions: anger, disbelief, and an undercurrent of sadness I couldn't quite shake. Clara's attempt to rewrite the past was as infuriating as it was pathetic. She wasn't just trying to justify her choices. She was trying to erase my dad's legacy, to make him the villain in a story where she could claim the role of victim. When I got home, I sank onto the couch and stared at my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to call someone, anyone, to vent about what had just happened. But who could I even talk to? Most of my close friends only knew bits and pieces of my family history, and the few who knew the full story had already spent years encouraging me to cut Clara out completely. Instead, I opened my laptop and began typing. Writing had always been my way of processing things, and this time was no different. I poured out everything Clara had said at the diner, every infuriating word, every veiled jab at my dad's memory. By the time I finished, I felt a small sense of relief, as if putting it all into words had lessened the weight on my chest. But as the days went by, that relief faded, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. Clara's claims about Dad's financial troubles and emotional struggles had stuck in my mind, not because I believed her, but because I feared how others might. She and Jerry had already tarnished his reputation in town years ago. If they started spreading these new lies, it could undo everything he'd worked so hard to rebuild. The thought made my stomach churn. Dad didn't deserve that. Not after everything he'd been through. I decided to reach out to one of Dad's old friends, Bill, 63M, who had worked with him at the company before everything fell apart. Bill had always been fiercely loyal to Dad, and I hoped he might have some insight into what Clara had said, or at least some reassurance that it was all nonsense. We met for coffee at a small cafe on the edge of town. Bill greeted me warmly, his graying hair and kind eyes, a reminder of the stability he had always offered during the chaos of my childhood. "It's good to see you, Allison," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "How are you holding up?" I hesitated, unsure how to begin. "I'm okay," I said finally, "but I've been struggling with some things," Clara said, at the funeral and afterward. Bill's expression darkened slightly. "Clara, I was wondering when she'd come back into the picture." "She's been pushing this narrative about Dad," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "saying he made bad investments and was emotionally unstable before she left, that it wasn't just about the affair." Bill leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing. "That's a load of bull," he said bluntly. "Your father was one of the smartest, most level-headed men I've ever worked with. If there were financial issues, it wasn't because of him. And emotionally, he was under a lot of stress, sure, but who wouldn't be, given what Clara and Jerry did to him?" Hearing Bill's words felt like a lifeline. "So it's all lies? She's just trying to rewrite history?" Bill nodded firmly. "That's exactly what it is. Clara's always been good at spinning things to make herself look better, but anyone who knew your father knows the truth. He was a good man who worked himself to the bone to provide for you, even after everything fell apart." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I quickly wiped them away. "Thank you," I whispered. "I needed to hear that." Bill reached across the table and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. "Don't let her get in your head, Allison. Your dad's legacy is safe with the people who mattered to him. Clara and Jerry can talk all they want, but they can't erase the truth." That evening, I sat on my balcony, staring out at the fading sunset. Bill's words had brought me some comfort, but the anger still lingered. Clara and Jerry had already taken so much from me and my dad. I wasn't going to let them take anything more. When Clara texted me again the next day, I didn't hesitate to respond this time. "We're done, Mom. Stop calling. Stop texting. I don't want to hear from you or Jerry again." Her reply came within minutes. "Allison, don't be like this. We're family. We can work through this." I didn't bother responding. Instead, I blocked her number and deleted her messages, feeling a strange sense of finality as I did. It wasn't an easy decision. Part of me still wanted to believe there was a way to salvage something with Clara, to rebuild some semblance of a relationship. But the reality was clear. Clara wasn't interested in healing. She was interested in absolution. And I couldn't give her that. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally taking control, not just of my relationship with Clara, but of my own life. It wouldn't be easy, but I knew Dad would have been proud of me for standing my ground. And that was all the validation I needed. Blocking Clara and Jerry should have felt like a relief, but the days that followed were anything but peaceful. Cutting ties brought an odd mix of emotions. Freedom mingled with guilt, clarity tinged with uncertainty. For so long, even when I wasn't speaking to them, they had loomed in the background of my life, their influence lingering like a shadow I couldn't shake. Now that I'd taken a definitive step to shut them out, I found myself questioning what came next. The answer came sooner than I expected. A week later, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Urgent. Family matters." I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something made me pause. Opening the message, my stomach sank as I read. Allison, I know you've made it clear you don't want to talk, but this is important. Jerry and I are considering legal action regarding your father's estate, and we need to discuss your role in the matter. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Contact us as soon as possible. Clara. Legal action? My role? What were they even talking about? My dad had settled his estate long before his passing, leaving everything to me. Jerry and Clara had no claim to anything. Not after the way they'd left, not after the years of betrayal. I forwarded the email to the family lawyer, Mr. Green, 65M, a no-nonsense man who had worked with my dad for decades. He called me the next day, his tone calm but firm. I received your email, Allison, he said. Clara and Jerry don't have a legal leg to stand on. Your father's estate was finalized years ago. They may be trying to contest it, but from what I see, it's nothing more than an empty threat. Then why bother? I asked, frustration bleeding into my voice. Why stir this up now? Leverage, he replied simply. They're trying to get a reaction out of you. It's likely they hope you'll engage, maybe even offer a settlement just to make them go away. My advice? Ignore them. Let me handle it. Ignoring them sounded good in theory, but in practice, it wasn't so simple. The thought of Clara and Jerry dragging my dad's name through the mud, even in a baseless legal claim, made my blood boil. The idea that they would try to profit off the man they'd betrayed was almost too much to bear. That evening, I called Bill again. As soon as he answered, I spilled everything, my voice trembling with anger. They're trying to contest Dad's estate, I said. They want something, money, leverage. I don't even know. I can't let them do this. Bill listened patiently, his tone calm when he finally spoke. Allison, I know this feels like a fight you have to take on, but don't let them bait you. They want to rile you up to make you engage on their terms. Don't give them that power. How am I supposed to just do nothing? I asked, pacing my apartment. You're not doing nothing, he said. You've got Green handling it. Trust him to take care of this. And remember, your dad's legacy doesn't depend on what Clara and Jerry say or do. It lives in the people who knew him, who respected him. People like you. His words brought me a measure of comfort, but they didn't erase the anger completely. I spent the rest of the night drafting a response to Clara's email. Not to send, but just to get the words out of my system. By the time I finished, my thoughts were clearer. I wouldn't let Clara and Jerry drag me into their mess. I wouldn't let them use their lies to manipulate me or tarnish my dad's memory. But ignoring them didn't mean I was done fighting. The next week was quiet. I didn't hear from Clara or Jerry, and Mr. Green assured me there had been no legal filings or claims to follow up on. For the first time in what felt like months, I allowed myself to exhale. Then, out of the blue, I received a text from an old family friend, Janice, 56F. Allison, I just wanted to check in. I ran into Clara at the market today. She was saying some things about your dad. I wasn't sure if you knew. My heart sank as I typed back, "What things?" Janice's reply came quickly. She said he left the business in financial ruin and that she and Jerry had to clean up his mess. It didn't sound right, but she was pretty convincing. Convincing. That word sent a fresh wave of anger surging through me. Clara wasn't just trying to rewrite history in private. She was spreading her lies around town, trying to reshape the narrative to suit her own agenda. That night, I called Mr. Green again, this time with a new sense of urgency. She's telling people Dad ruined the business, I said, pacing my living room. She's painting him as a failure. I can't let her get away with this. Mr. Green sighed, his tone measured. Allison, defamation is a tricky thing to pursue, especially in cases like this. If you want to address it, the best approach might be a public one, setting the record straight in your own way. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, the weight of his words settling over me. Setting the record straight. Could I do that? Could I step into the spotlight Clara had stolen and fight back on my dad's behalf? The thought terrified me, but it also filled me with resolve. My dad had spent his life fighting for his family, for his integrity, for the values that Clara and Jerry had tried to destroy. The least I could do was fight for his memory. I didn't know exactly how I would do it yet, but one thing was clear. I wouldn't let Clara and Jerry have the final word. Not now. Not ever. The decision to fight back wasn't an easy one, but it felt necessary. If Clara and Jerry were so determined to rewrite the past, then I would make sure the truth was louder than their lies. My dad deserved that much. I spent the next few days reaching out to people who had worked with my dad, family friends who knew the real story of what had happened with the business. The response was overwhelming. Nearly everyone I spoke to shared the same sentiment. My dad had been a good man, an honest man, who had done everything he could to protect his company and his family. It wasn't David who made the bad deals, Bill reminded me during one of our conversations. That was Jerry, plain and simple. David took the fall because he was trying to keep the company afloat after Jerry's selfish decisions almost tanked it. Everyone who was there knows that. Hearing that only fueled my determination. Clara and Jerry might have tried to bury the truth, but the people who knew my dad, who truly respected him, hadn't forgotten. With their support, I decided to write an open letter to the local paper, something that would set the record straight once and for all. It took me 3 days to draft it. Every word had to be perfect. Every sentence had to strike the right balance between firm and respectful. I didn't want to stoop to Clara and Jerry's level by slinging mud, but I also wasn't going to hold back. When I finished, the letter was everything I needed it to be. I outlined my dad's contributions to the business and the community, the sacrifices he'd made after Clara and Jerry's betrayal, and the strength he'd shown in rebuilding his life. I didn't name them directly, but the subtext was clear enough for anyone paying attention. David Hughes was a man of integrity, I wrote in the final paragraph. While others chose to take shortcuts and prioritize their own interests, he stood by his values. For those who knew him, the truth of his character is undeniable. And for those who didn't, well, the truth has a way of enduring, no matter how much others try to distort it. When the letter was published the following week, the response was immediate. I received texts and calls from people in town thanking me for speaking up, for honoring my dad's memory in a way that felt long overdue. But predictably, Clara and Jerry weren't happy. It didn't take long for Clara to find a way to respond. 2 days after the letter was published, I received an email from her. Not a polite request to meet, but a scathing diatribe that barely masked her fury. Allison, I can't believe you would stoop so low as to air our family's dirty laundry in public. Your father wouldn't have wanted this. You're making us out to be villains when all we've ever tried to do is make peace. This is beneath you. I deleted the email without replying. The next day, I heard from a friend who worked at the local paper that Jerry had tried to submit a rebuttal letter, filled with accusations about my dad's supposed financial recklessness. The editor had refused to publish it, citing a lack of evidence and a clear bias. When I found out, I couldn't help but laugh. For all their posturing, Clara and Jerry were finally losing control of the narrative, and they didn't know how to handle it. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally free of Clara and Jerry's influence. They had tried to manipulate me, to guilt me, to rewrite my dad's legacy, and they had failed. I focused on my own life, throwing myself into work and reconnecting with friends I'd drifted away from. The weight of everything that had happened was still there, but it felt lighter now, easier to carry. One evening, Bill invited me to a small gathering at his home, a chance to catch up with some of the people who had worked with my dad over the years. As I walked through the familiar crowd, listening to their stories and laughter, I felt a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "This is what your dad would have wanted," Bill said, as we stood on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "For you to move forward, to find peace, and to remember the good he left behind." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. He deserved better than what Clara and Jerry put him through, but I'm glad people still remember him for who he really was. "They always will," Bill said firmly. "People like Clara and Jerry, they fade. But your dad's legacy, that's something real, something that lasts." As I left the party that night, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't thought was possible. The fight wasn't over. Not entirely. Clara and Jerry might try again in some new way to assert their version of events, but I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I had the truth, and that was enough. In the weeks following the publication of my letter, I noticed a change in the way people spoke to me about my dad. Where before there had been cautious sympathy, as if they didn't know how to address the messy history surrounding my family, There was now genuine warmth and respect. It was as if the letter had given them permission to remember him as the man he truly was, without the shadow of Clara and Jerry tainting his memory. But while the community seemed to rally behind me, Clara and Jerry didn't retreat quietly. They were used to controlling the narrative, and my letter had upended their carefully crafted story. It started small, subtle digs and insinuations that made their way back to me through mutual acquaintances. At a neighborhood barbecue, someone mentioned overhearing Jerry telling a group that my letter was a desperate attempt to rewrite history, and that I was too young to understand the full picture. "He's making himself sound like the victim," I told Bill when I called him to vent about it. "Of course he is," Bill replied, his voice steady. "People like Jerry always do. But don't let it get to you, Allison. The truth has already spoken for itself." That was easier said than done. Knowing Jerry and Clara were still trying to undermine me made my skin crawl. It wasn't just about me, it was about protecting my dad's legacy. Every whisper, every sly comment felt like a personal attack on his memory. Then came the real escalation. One afternoon, as I was leaving work, I noticed a man sitting on a bench near the parking lot. He was dressed casually, holding a coffee cup and flipping through a newspaper, but something about him felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the way he glanced at me as I walked to my car set off alarm bells. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But over the next few days, I started seeing him more often, in the parking lot near my apartment building, even at the cafe I frequented. He never approached me, but his presence was unsettling enough that I finally mentioned it to a coworker. "You think someone's following you?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's weird, and it started not long after all that stuff with my mom and Jerry." She frowned. "You don't think they'd hire someone, do you? Like a private investigator or something?" The thought hadn't crossed my mind until that moment, but now that it had, I couldn't shake it. Clara and Jerry had already shown they were willing to manipulate and intimidate to get what they wanted. Hiring someone to dig into my life didn't seem out of the question. That evening, I called Mr. Green to share my concerns. If they're trying to gather information on me, is there anything they could actually use? I asked, anxiety creeping into my voice. "Unlikely," he said, his tone calm and reassuring. "Your father's estate is airtight, and there's nothing in your personal life that would give them leverage. But if you're feeling unsafe, I'd recommend documenting these incidents and filing a report with the police." I took his advice, snapping photos of the man whenever I saw him and jotting down the times and locations. I hated feeling like I had to look over my shoulder constantly, but ignoring the situation wasn't an option. A week later, the tension came to a head. I was walking to my car after a late shift at work when I spotted the man again, this time leaning against the hood of a car parked a few spaces away from mine. My pulse quickened as I approached, my phone clenched tightly in my hand. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. He looked up, startled, then quickly shook his head. "No, ma'am, just waiting for someone." I didn't buy it. Without breaking eye contact, I raised my phone and snapped a photo. His expression shifted to one of annoyance, and he turned away, muttering something under his breath as he walked toward the far end of the lot. When I got home, I forwarded the photo to Mr. Green and asked if he'd heard anything new from Clara or Jerry. His response came quickly. "They've been quiet on the legal front, but I wouldn't put it past them to try intimidation tactics. Stay vigilant, Allison. Let me know if anything else happens." The incident shook me, but it also reinforced something I'd been slowly coming to realize. Clara and Jerry weren't just trying to salvage their reputation. They were trying to silence me. The realization fueled a new sense of determination. If they thought they could scare me into backing down, they didn't know me as well as they thought. The next morning, I contacted the editor of the local paper and asked if they'd be willing to run a follow-up piece, a more in-depth look at my dad's contributions to the community and the challenges he'd faced in the wake of Clara and Jerry's betrayal. The editor was immediately on board, and within a week, the article was published. It wasn't just a tribute, it was a statement. The piece included quotes from former coworkers and friends, all of whom spoke about my dad's integrity, his work ethic, and the sacrifices he'd made for his family. The article ended with a quote from Bill. David Hughes was a man who faced adversity with grace and determination. His legacy speaks for itself, no matter what anyone might say to the contrary. The response was overwhelming. People stopped me on the street to tell me how much they admired my dad, how grateful they were for everything he'd done for the community. As for Clara and Jerry, I didn't hear a word from them, but I knew they'd read the article, and I knew they hated every word of it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally ahead of them, finally taking back the power they'd stolen from me and my dad, and I wasn't about to let it go. The follow-up article was a turning point. It didn't just honor my dad's legacy, it exposed Clara and Jerry's attempts to distort the truth for what they were: petty, self-serving lies. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning in my favor, and the weight of their manipulations was finally lifting. But Clara and Jerry weren't ones to fade quietly into the background. 2 weeks after the article was published, I received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten on expensive stationery and bore Clara's unmistakable cursive. My stomach churned as I read. Allison, I've tried to reach you in every way I know how, but you've made it clear you don't want to speak to me. Still, I can't let things end like this. Jerry and I are willing to move forward, but we need to have an honest discussion about the way you've been portraying us. We've done nothing but try to help you, and your recent actions have made that impossible. This isn't what your father would have wanted. Please contact me before this situation escalates further. Love, Mom. I read the letter twice, my hands shaking. Escalates further? What was that supposed to mean? Was it another empty threat, or were they planning something new? I forwarded the letter to Mr. Green, who responded almost immediately. Don't engage. This is a transparent attempt to bait you into reacting. Let me handle it. I trusted his advice, but that didn't make the situation any less infuriating. No matter how many times I shut them out, Clara and Jerry found new ways to insert themselves into my life. It was exhausting, and the longer it dragged on, the more it felt like a battle of endurance. That weekend, I decided to visit my dad's gravesite. It wasn't something I did often, partly because it was still too raw, and partly because I hated how the cemetery seemed to magnify the absence I felt every day. But with everything that had been happening, I felt like I needed to be there to find some sense of peace. The cemetery was quiet when I arrived, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. I knelt by my dad's headstone, tracing the carved letters of his name with my fingers. Hey, Dad, I whispered, my voice trembling. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I'm trying. I really am. But it's hard. Clara and Jerry, they're not giving up, and I miss you. The words hung in the air, unanswered, but somehow speaking them out loud made me feel a little lighter. I sat there for a while, letting the quiet settle over me. But just as I was getting ready to leave, I noticed something that made my breath catch. A bouquet of fresh flowers sitting on the other side of the headstone. They weren't mine. My stomach twisted as I realized who must have left them. Clara. The thought of her standing here in this sacred space made my skin crawl. What right did she have to come here after everything she'd done? What could she possibly say to him that would make up for the years of pain she'd caused? I picked up the bouquet and stared at it, my anger bubbling to the surface. For a brief, spiteful moment, I thought about throwing the flowers in the trash. But I stopped myself. This wasn't about her. It was about me and my dad. I set the bouquet back down, carefully arranging it beside my own. She doesn't deserve you, I whispered, my voice shaking, but I won't let her take this away too. I promise. When I got home, I found a voicemail waiting for me. It was from Janice, my dad's old friend. Allison, I just thought you should know. I saw Clara at the cemetery this morning. She was talking to some people, saying things about your dad that didn't sit right. You might want to look into it. My blood ran cold. What was Clara up to now? I called Janice back immediately, and she filled in the gaps. She was with some people I didn't recognize, looked like reporters maybe. She was talking about how hard it was for her after the divorce, how she and Jerry had to rebuild everything from scratch after David left them in a bad place. I didn't stay long, but it didn't sound good. I thanked Janice, my mind racing. Clara wasn't just spreading lies to neighbors anymore. She was taking her story to the press. I called Mr. Green to update him. If she's trying to smear my dad in public, what do I do? I can't just sit back and let this happen. Mr. Green sighed. This is exactly what she wants, Allison. She's trying to provoke a reaction. If you engage publicly, you're giving her exactly what she needs to keep this fight going. But if I don't respond, people will believe her, I said, frustration creeping into my voice. She's already telling reporters her version of the story. How do I fight that without speaking up? There was a long pause before Mr. Green replied, We'll find a way. But you need to be strategic about this. The truth is on your side, Allison, and the people who matter already know that. Don't let her drag you into the mud. That night, I couldn't sleep. Clara's escalation was a reminder of how relentless she and Jerry could be. They wouldn't stop until they had control of the narrative or until I gave them a reason to back off. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized something important. They were already losing. Every move they made reeked of desperation, a last-ditch effort to rewrite a story that everyone else had already heard and dismissed. And I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of dragging me down with them. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. Clara and Jerry had spent years trying to spin their version of events, to bend reality to suit their needs, but their desperation was finally becoming obvious. The cracks in their carefully constructed facade were showing, and I wasn't about to let them patch it up at my expense. I started the day by making a list of everything still hanging over me, the loose ends they were trying to exploit, the vague legal threats, the private investigator who I still suspected was their doing, the article in the local paper. I couldn't confront them all at once, but I could take them on one by one. My first call was to Mr. Green. I want to file a formal complaint about the man who's been following me, I told him. If Clara and Jerry hired him, I want it on record that this is harassment. Mr. Green was immediately supportive. I'll help you draft the paperwork, document everything you've observed, the dates, the times, even the photos you've taken. If they're hiring someone to intimidate you, we'll make sure it doesn't go unnoticed. By the time I hung up, I felt lighter. Taking action, even a small step, gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in weeks. My next focus was the narrative they were trying to push in the community. The article in the local paper had been subtle, but it was damaging enough that I couldn't ignore it. Instead of reacting directly, I reached out to people who had worked with my dad, former employees, business partners, even competitors who had respected him. I asked them to write letters to the editor, sharing their own stories about my dad's integrity and contributions to the community. Within days, the paper was flooded with testimonials. One by one, they painted a picture of the man Clara and Jerry couldn't tarnish, no matter how hard they tried. David Hughes was the most honorable man I ever worked with, one letter read. His dedication to his family and his business was unmatched. Anyone who claims otherwise is either misinformed or deliberately misleading. It was exactly what I needed. For every lie Clara and Jerry tried to spread, the truth was right there waiting to expose them. But Clara wasn't finished. A week after the letters were published, I received an email from her. This time, it was different. There was no anger, no accusations, just a single line that stopped me cold. I have information about your father that you don't know. Call me if you want to hear it. My stomach churned as I read the message. It felt like another manipulation, another attempt to bait me into reacting. But a small part of me couldn't shake the question. What if she wasn't lying? What if there really was something I didn't know? I forwarded the email to Mr. Green, who called me immediately. This is classic Clara, he said. She's trying to plant doubt in your mind. Don't let her. If there were anything significant about your father's affairs, we'd already know. He was right, of course. But the seed of doubt had already been planted. What if there was something Clara could use against me? Something that would undo everything I'd worked so hard to protect. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at my phone. I wanted to call her, to demand answers, but I knew that was exactly what she wanted. Instead, I typed out a short reply. If you have something to say, put it in writing. I won't respond to anything else. Her response came minutes later. Fine. You'll regret this. Over the next week, I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from Clara's cryptic message. But no matter how busy I kept myself, her words lingered in the back of my mind. What was she planning, and how far was she willing to go? The answer came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, I received a call from Janice. "Allison, you're not going to believe this," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Clara and Jerry are hosting an event at the community center next week. They're calling it a family legacy fundraiser. Apparently, it's all about celebrating your dad's contributions to the town." My blood ran cold. "They're what?" "You heard me," Janice said. "I don't know the details, but I thought you should know. It sounds like another one of their attempts to rewrite history." I couldn't believe the audacity. After everything they'd done, they were now trying to position themselves as the champions of my dad's legacy. It was infuriating and entirely in character. But this time, I wouldn't sit back and let them take control. They wanted to play this game in public? Fine. I'd make sure the truth was front and center, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. Clara and Jerry hosting a family legacy fundraiser was a move so brazen it almost felt like a parody. They had spent years dismantling my dad's reputation, twisting the narrative to suit their needs, and now they wanted to publicly celebrate the very legacy they'd tried to erase. It was a slap in the face. But more than that, it was an opportunity. If they wanted to bring the fight into the public eye, I'd meet them there, and I wouldn't hold back. The first thing I did was gather my allies. I reached out to Bill, Janice, and the former employees who had contributed letters to the paper. Together, we brainstormed ways to counter whatever narrative Clara and Jerry were planning to push at the event. "We need to make it clear that this isn't about them," Bill said during one of our meetings. "If they're going to use David's name, the focus needs to stay on him, not their twisted version of events." Janice nodded. "We should show up with something tangible. Photos, documents, anything that proves who David really was and what he stood for." It was a good idea, and I spent the next few days digging through old family albums, business records, and community awards my dad had received. Every piece of evidence was a testament to his integrity, his dedication, and his contributions to the town. But I wasn't just preparing for the fundraiser. I was preparing for the fallout. Clara and Jerry were masters of manipulation, and I knew they wouldn't back down without a fight. The day of the event arrived, and I showed up early with Bill and Janice. The community center was already bustling with activity. Clara and Jerry had pulled out all the stops, banners, catering, even a slideshow playing on a projector. It was surreal to see my dad's face plastered across the room, surrounded by decorations that screamed celebration, as if the years of betrayal had never happened. Clara spotted me almost immediately. She made her way over, her smile tight and insincere. "Allison," she said, her tone syrupy sweet. "I'm so glad you came. I wasn't sure you'd be willing to join us, given everything." I met her gaze evenly. "I wouldn't miss it," I said. "After all, this is about Dad, isn't it?" Her smile faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Of course, everything Jerry and I have done has been to honor his memory." Before I could respond, Jerry joined us, clapping me on the shoulder like we were old friends. "Nice to see you, Allison," he said, his voice dripping with fake warmth. "We were just telling everyone how proud David would be to see us all coming together like this." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stay calm. "I'm sure he'd be proud of the truth," I said. Jerry's expression darkened slightly, but Clara placed a hand on his arm, steering him away. "We'll let you mingle," she said over her shoulder. "Enjoy the event." As the evening went on, Clara and Jerry worked the room, chatting with guests and positioning themselves as the keepers of my dad's legacy. It was nauseating to watch, but I stayed focused on my plan. When it came time for speeches, I stepped up to the podium after Clara finished hers. She had delivered a carefully rehearsed narrative, painting herself and Jerry as the unsung heroes who had supported David through difficult times. I took a deep breath as I faced the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began. "This event is meant to honor my father's legacy, and I want to take a moment to share what that truly means." I spoke about my dad's dedication to his work, his family, and his community. I shared stories of the sacrifices he'd made to keep the business afloat after Jerry's betrayal, and the resilience he'd shown in rebuilding his life. David Hughes was a man of integrity, I said, my voice steady. He faced challenges with grace and strength, and he never wavered in his commitment to doing what was right. That's the legacy we're here to celebrate, not just tonight, but every day. As I stepped down, the applause was louder than I'd expected. Clara and Jerry sat stone-faced, their carefully crafted narrative unraveling in real time. After the speeches, several guests approached me to share their own memories of my dad. Many of them echoed what I'd already heard, stories of his kindness, his work ethic, and the respect he'd earned in the community. But one guest stood out. It was Marcy, 55F, a former employee who had worked for both my dad and Jerry before the fallout. "I've been meaning to tell you this for a long time," she said, her voice low. "Jerry tried to pin the company's financial problems on your dad, but it was his own mismanagement that caused the trouble. David took the blame because he didn't want to drag things through the mud. He thought it was better for the business to let Jerry walk away quietly." Hearing that was like a missing puzzle piece clicking into place. My dad's selflessness had cost him everything, and Jerry had used it as a stepping stone to claim the moral high ground. "Would you be willing to go on record with that?" I asked, my mind racing. Marcy hesitated but nodded. For David, absolutely. As the event wound down, I left the community center feeling more determined than ever. Clara and Jerry might have had to hijack my dad's legacy, but the truth was coming to light piece by piece. I wasn't finished with them yet, not by a long shot. After the fundraiser, Clara and Jerry's fragile narrative began to crumble, and I was ready to drive the final nail into its coffin. Marcy's willingness to speak out was a gift I hadn't expected, but it came with risks. She'd worked closely with both my dad and Jerry during the fallout, and her testimony could easily be dismissed as biased or personal. If I wanted her story to stick, I needed to pair it with something concrete. I spent the next week combing through old records, files my dad had stored in the attic, boxes of receipts and ledgers he'd kept after leaving the company. It was tedious work, but as I sifted through the papers, I started to see the patterns Marcy had described. Jerry's business decisions had been reckless at best, fraudulent at worst. Misallocated funds, bloated expenses for his own gain, and a paper trail that led directly to the financial strain my dad had been forced to shoulder. The smoking gun came in the form of a memo, one that detailed a series of expenses Jerry had approved under the guise of corporate growth initiatives. The numbers didn't add up, and it was clear he'd been funneling company money into personal ventures. Armed with this evidence, I met with Mr. Inne Green to discuss next steps. "This is strong," he said, flipping through the documents. "If you wanted to file a formal complaint or even pursue legal action, this would be enough to start a case." I shook my head. "I don't want to go down that road, not unless I have to. But I do want this information out there. People need to know the truth." Mr. Green nodded. "We'll do this carefully. Release it through credible channels. Make it clear this isn't about retaliation. It's about setting the record straight." The first step was an article in the same local paper Clara and Jerry had used to plant their lies. This time, the piece wasn't just about honoring my dad, it was about exposing the truth. With Marcy's statement and the documents I'd uncovered, the story painted a clear picture of how Jerry had mismanaged the company and left my dad to clean up the mess. David Hughes took responsibility for actions that weren't his own, the article concluded. In doing so, he demonstrated a level of integrity that stands in stark contrast to the self-serving behavior of those who sought to tarnish his name. When the article was published, the backlash against Clara and Jerry was swift. I received messages from people all over town, former colleagues, neighbors, even some of Jerry's old friends, expressing their disgust at the lengths they'd gone to manipulate the truth. "You've done it now," Bill said when I called him to talk about the response. "They can't spin their way out of this. Not with evidence like that." I wanted to believe him, but a part of me knew better. Clara and Jerry weren't the type to admit defeat, no matter how damning the truth might be. Sure enough, a few days later I received another letter in the mail. This one was shorter than the last, but it was dripping with venom. "Allison, you've crossed a line. This isn't just about David anymore. It's about respect for your family, which you clearly have none of. If you continue down this path, don't expect us to sit back and let you destroy everything we've worked for. Consider this your final warning. Clara. The threat was laughable, but it also reinforced something I already knew. They were scared. For the first time, they weren't in control, and it was driving them to desperation. I forwarded the letter to Mr. Green, who responded with a single sentence: let them try. With the truth out in the open, I turned my attention to the community. Clara and Jerry might have lost credibility, but I wanted to make sure my dad's legacy was firmly cemented. I organized a scholarship fund in his name, partnering with a local nonprofit to support students pursuing careers in business and entrepreneurship. The announcement was met with overwhelming support, and donations poured in from people who had known my dad or been inspired by his story. At the launch event, I spoke about my dad's dedication to helping others and the lessons he'd taught me about resilience and integrity. As I looked out at the crowd, I felt a deep sense of pride, not just for what I'd accomplished, but for the man who had inspired it all. This was his legacy, and no one could take it away. But Clara and Jerry weren't done yet. 2 weeks after the scholarship launch, I received a tip from an anonymous source. Jerry was planning to hold a press conference to clear the air. The event was scheduled for the following week, and it was clear they intended to use it as a platform to regain control of the narrative. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. How many times could they recycle the same tired lies before realizing no one believed them? "Are you going to do anything about it?" Janice asked when I told her about the press conference. "No," I said firmly. "I've said everything I need to say. If they want to humiliate themselves further, that's on them." But as the day of the press conference approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that Clara and Jerry still had something up their sleeves. Something they thought would give them the upper hand. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let them win. The day of Clara and Jerry's press conference arrived, and I braced myself for whatever stunt they had planned. Despite my resolve to stay out of it, the tension gnawed at me. I knew their desperation would drive them to extremes, and I couldn't ignore the nagging fear that they might stoop lower than ever before. Janice called me that morning. "You're not going, are you?" she asked, her tone wary. "No," I said. "I won't give them the satisfaction. Besides, there's nothing they can say that'll undo what's already out there. People know the truth now." Still, I kept my phone close, waiting for updates from Bill and others who had promised to attend and keep an eye on things. The press conference was held in a small meeting room at a local hotel, a far cry from the community center where they'd staged their last spectacle. From what I'd heard, attendance was sparse, just a few reporters and a handful of acquaintances who still sided with them. Clara opened the conference with her usual polished demeanor, feigning sorrow as she spoke about the challenges my dad had faced in his later years. "David was a good man," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "But he struggled with the pressures of running a business and providing for his family. Jerry and I did everything we could to support him, but unfortunately not everyone has been willing to acknowledge that." Her words were calculated, just vague enough to avoid outright defamation while still casting doubt on my dad's character. Then Jerry took the podium. Unlike Clara, he didn't bother with subtlety. "Certain individuals have gone out of their way to slander my wife and me," he said, his voice dripping with indignation. "They've twisted the truth and manipulated the public, all to paint themselves as victims. It's time to set the record straight." According to Bill, who texted me a play-by-play of the event, Jerry then launched into a tirade about the article I'd published, claiming it was full of baseless accusations and half-truths. He even went so far as to present a stack of documents he claimed were evidence of his innocence, though he conveniently declined to provide copies for the reporters. The low point came when Jerry took aim at me directly. "This campaign of lies has been driven by a personal vendetta," he said, his voice rising. "Allison Hughes has made it her mission to destroy our reputation, and in doing so, she's tarnished the very legacy she claims to care about." When Bill texted me that, my blood boiled. Clara and Jerry had spent years tearing down my dad's reputation, and now they were accusing me of doing the same. By the time the press conference ended, I was seething. But as the hours passed and the first reports trickled in, my anger gave way to something else: relief. The reporters who attended weren't buying what Clara and Jerry were selling. Their accounts of the event were skeptical at best, pointing out inconsistencies in Jerry's statements and questioning the lack of evidence to support their claims. It was a desperate attempt to salvage their reputation, one article read. But the Hughes family's truth bolstered by a mountain of documented evidence stands firm. For the first time, Clara and Jerry's manipulations were being met with open skepticism. The community wasn't falling for their act anymore, and it was clear they were losing whatever influence they had left. The next day, I received an unexpected call from Marcy. "I heard about the press conference," she said. "It's pathetic, honestly, but there's something else you should know." I leaned forward in my chair, my heart pounding. "What is it?" "Jerry's been talking to some of the old employees," she said, "trying to get them to back his version of events. But no one's biting. If anything, it's making him look worse." The thought of Jerry scrambling to find allies was oddly satisfying. It confirmed what I'd suspected all along. They were running out of options. "Thanks for letting me know," I said. "I'll keep an eye on it." Over the next few weeks, Clara and Jerry's presence in town dwindled. The press conference had backfired spectacularly, and their remaining supporters seemed to be distancing themselves. Even the whispers and gossip that had once surrounded my dad's name were beginning to fade. But I wasn't ready to let my guard down. As much as I wanted to believe they were done, I knew how relentless they could be. One evening, as I was organizing files for the scholarship fund, my phone buzzed with a text from Janice. "Just heard from a friend Clara and Jerry are leaving town. Apparently they've decided to start fresh somewhere else. Thought you'd want to know." I stared at the message, my emotions swirling: relief, disbelief, and a cautious sense of victory all mingled together. If they were truly leaving, it felt like the end of an era, one defined by pain, betrayal, and constant conflict. But it was also the start of something new, something free from their shadow. I typed a reply: "Thanks, Janice. Let's hope it stays that way." And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope it really would. The news of Clara and Jerry leaving town spread quickly. For years, their presence had loomed like a storm cloud over my life, but now it seemed they were finally retreating. I wanted to believe it was over, that their departure marked the end of their manipulation and interference. But part of me couldn't help but remain cautious. Their track record had taught me one thing: they thrived on control. Leaving town felt too much like surrender, and Clara and Jerry weren't the type to give up easily. A week later, my doubts were confirmed. I was at home reviewing applications for the scholarship fund when my phone rang. It was Mr. Green. His voice, usually calm and composed, carried an edge of urgency. "Allison," he began, "I just received notice of a legal filing from Clara and Jerry. They're contesting the terms of your father's estate again." "What?" I said, my chest tightening. "They can't do that. The estate was settled years ago." "They're claiming new evidence," he said grimly. "From what I've seen, it's baseless, but they're alleging that your father wasn't of sound mind when he finalized his will. They're trying to invalidate it and force a redistribution." The air left my lungs as I processed his words. How is this even possible? We have years of proof that Dad's estate was handled properly. "They don't have a case," Mr. Green assured me, "but that doesn't mean they can't drag this out in court. Their goal isn't to win, it's to wear you down." I sat in stunned silence, my mind racing. Just when I thought I was free of them, they'd found a way to pull me back into their web. Over the next few days, I gathered every piece of evidence I had to refute their claims. Mr. Green worked tirelessly to prepare a response, but the stress was overwhelming. Clara and Jerry's new tactic wasn't just about the estate, it was about control. They wanted to show me that no matter how far they fell, they still had the power to disrupt my life. Bill called me one evening, his voice full of concern. "I heard about the legal filing," he said. "How are you holding up?" "I'm exhausted," I admitted. "I thought we were done with this, but they just keep finding new ways to come after me." "You've been fighting this battle alone for too long," he said firmly. "Let us help. You have a whole community behind you, Allison. Use it." His words struck a chord. I'd spent so much time trying to handle Clara and Jerry on my own, afraid to show weakness or ask for help. But maybe Bill was right. Maybe it was time to lean on the people who had supported me all along. The following week, I held a meeting with a group of family friends, former colleagues of my dad, and members of the community who had stood by me. Together, we devised a plan to counter Clara and Jerry's latest attack. We started with public support. Letters poured into the local paper and community forums, defending my dad's legacy and condemning Clara and Jerry's behavior. The outpouring of solidarity was overwhelming, and it sent a clear message. The town wasn't buying their lies. Meanwhile, Mr. Green worked to dismantle their legal claims. He gathered testimony from my dad's doctors, financial advisors, and anyone else who could attest to his sound mind during the creation of his will. Every piece of evidence further discredited Clara and Jerry's case, leaving them with little room to maneuver. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. One afternoon, Marcy called me with news that changed everything. "I just got off the phone with an old coworker," she said. "They told me something about Jerry that might help you." "What is it?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "Apparently, Jerry's been hiding some financial skeletons of his own. There's evidence he misused company funds during his time at the business expenses he claimed were for the company, but were actually personal. If we can get our hands on that documentation, it could destroy his credibility entirely." My pulse quickened. "Do you know where we can find it?" "I think I do," she said. "I'll make a few calls." Within days, Marcy delivered. She tracked down old financial records from the company, and they painted a damning picture. Jerry had siphoned money from the business for years, funding personal ventures and padding his own pockets while my dad struggled to keep the company afloat. Mr. Green reviewed the records and immediately filed a countersuit, accusing Jerry of fraud and seeking damages on behalf of my dad's estate. "This changes everything," he told me. "If they want to fight, they're about to get one." When the countersuit was filed, Clara and Jerry's response was swift. Their lawyer reached out to Mr. Green, proposing an immediate settlement to avoid further escalation. It was the first sign of real fear I'd seen from them, and it was immensely satisfying. But I wasn't interested in a settlement. This wasn't just about money, it was about accountability. Over the next few weeks, their case unraveled completely. The evidence of Jerry's fraud, combined with the overwhelming community support for my dad, left them with no choice but to withdraw their claims. On the day the court dismissed their case, I stood outside the courthouse with Bill and Janice by my side. The weight I'd been carrying for years finally began to lift. "You did it," Janice said, her voice filled with pride. "You stood up to them, and you won." I smiled, tears welling in my eyes. We won. I couldn't have done this without all of you. With Clara and Jerry finally out of the picture, I turned my focus back to the scholarship fund and my own future. The scars of their betrayal would never fully heal, but I felt stronger than I ever had before. My dad's legacy wasn't just intact, it was thriving. And no matter what Clara and Jerry had tried to do, they couldn't take that away from me. As I stood in front of the scholarship recipients at the year's first award ceremony, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. "This isn't just about honoring the past," I told them. "It's about building a future that reflects the values my dad lived by: integrity, resilience, and the belief that we all have the power to make a difference." And as the applause filled the room, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them. I'd protected my dad's legacy, and I'd reclaimed my own.